Who would have thought that it would be the Russian nation, which proclaimed itself the global leader of communism and anti-colonialism in the 20th century, would lead one of the most brutal colonial conquests in the 21st century? If it was once possible to argue that it was missionary communism against capitalism that led the Russian nation to expansionism, this explanation is no longer sufficient. The truth is that Russian colonialism has a long history, which dates 5 centuries back. The Russian nation had 500 years to craft a story of exceptionalism, to grab and rob lands, suppress nations, and create the largest land empire in the world. The difference of Russian colonialism from other European empires, however, is that its metropole never democratized or engaged in self-critical enlightenment. This means that its colonized knew no mercy. Communism itself thrived on Russian colonialism. When the Russian Tsarist Empire collapsed after World War I in 1917, and its numerous colonized nations like Ukraine, Finland, Latvia, Georgia, Estonia, Armenia, Poland, Bessarabia, Belarus, Kazakhs, and Bashkorts, and many others proclaimed independence or autonomy, Communist Moscow brutally reconquered most of them, killing at least 10 million people. In the new communist empire, Bolsheviks proclaimed the Russian nation to be the superior one. Consider this fact. In their national anthems, non-Russian colonized nations had to praise and thank the Russian people for the supposedly bright life under the communist dictatorship. I was one of the children in Soviet Kazakhstan who had to sing an anthem with words, "To the great Russian people we say big thank you." I sang it without knowing that 40% of Kazakhs died in 1930s because of the starvation inflicted on the Kazakh people by Moscow. Moscow stole the cattle of Kazakh nomads, knowingly leaving millions to starvation. My grandmother's family perished in that hunger, and she was forcibly taken to a Russian orphanage where 60% of Kazakh children died. There she was taught to forget her language, her parents, and to praise the Russian nation for communism. As you know, in the Ukrainian case, 4 million people died, and today Ukrainian children are taken to Russia. Russian colonialism was historically based on the strategy of killing, deporting, and terrorizing the local population, Russifying them, and settling the territories with the Russian people. Consider this quote from a Russian colonial officer about the strategies of conquest in the Northern Caucasus in the 1860s. I quote, "The expulsion of half of the mountain people and the settlement with Russians, these were the war plan. The Russian population was not only to be the crowning glory of the conquest of the region, it was to become one of the main means of conquest." This strategy continued into the communist period. The Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and many others were killed and deported from their lands in the 1940s. Terrorized and forbidden to learn their languages, they were taught to praise the Russian nation instead. The Russian people, when settling, accepting privileges, and listening to Soviet anthems, learned to think that the colonized land is theirs. As a result, in 1989, the last communist ruler, Mikhail Gorbachev, argued against lending independence to non-Russian nations, which demanded independence, because he said, and I quote, "The Russian people are that way." Although in 1991 communism collapsed, the Russian imperial identity did not. For many of us who experienced Russian colonialism firsthand, there are 4 lessons from the 20th century. First, the collapse of the Soviet Russian Empire was the victory for the humanity. Millions of people received the possibility to live in dignity, freedom, and the ability to decide their own futures. This would not have been possible under the Russian occupation. Secondly, although communism failed, Russian colonialism did not. It was never questioned by the Russian intellectuals, liberal or illiberal, its leaders, and by the world at large. But we now know that it was not just communism that was incompatible with democracy, equality, and peace. In fact, it is Russian colonialism that is not. Thirdly, in 1991, Moscow argued that without its control, the colonized nations will present danger to the world. This was a colonial lie, and today we know that it is a colonial lie. Out of all former Soviet republics, it is the Russian one that presents the most danger to the world. Finally, Russian colonialism, just as communism, is not reformable because it is a system based on ideology. Just like communism, it has no future. Unlike communism, it can collapse only if actively defeated. Thank you.